The church bells rang hollow in the crisp autumn air. A small gathering of mourners, cloaked in black, huddled around the open grave, their faces pale beneath the overcast sky. The priest's voice droned in the background, a murmur lost to the wind, as Sophia stood motionless, her hand clutched tightly around the handle of Elena's favorite doll. It was an odd, almost grotesque gesture, but no one had the heart to take it from her. Not even Andrew, who stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the small white coffin, slowly descending into the earth. Sophia's face was ashen, her eyes distant, as if she were watching the scene from somewhere far away. Her grief was too deep for tears. Andrew occasionally glanced at her, hoping for a flicker of emotion, a sign that she was still there with him. But there was nothing, just the empty gaze of a mother who had lost everything. The ceremony ended. People mumbled their condolences, but their words were dull, meaningless sounds to Sophia's ears. Andrew nodded politely, shook a few hands, but his mind was elsewhere. He led Sophia to the car, his hand gentle on her back, guiding her as if she were fragile glass. When they arrived home, the silence swallowed them whole. The house had always been a refuge, a place filled with Eleanor's laughter, with the smell of freshly baked cookies and the constant hum of life. But now it was a mausoleum. The once vibrant living room felt suffocatingly still, the toys scattered across the floor, a cruel reminder of what was lost. Sophia sank onto the couch, still clutching the doll. Andrew watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with helplessness. He knew better than to speak. Words had lost their meaning. He walked to the kitchen, mechanically filling the kettle with water, though he doubted either of them would drink the tea. It was just something to do, something to keep from drowning in the weight of it all. Sophia stared blankly ahead, her mind drifting through a maze of memories. She remembered the mornings when Elena would crawl into their bed, her small, warm body wriggling between them, giggling as Andrew pretended to grumble about having no room. She could still feel the softness of Elena's hair against her cheek, hear her tiny feet padding down the hall, chasing the cat. Then, like a cruel twist of fate, the memory shifted. That day. They had gone to the park, just the two of them. The sun was high, the sky clear, and Eleanor had begged to stay longer. Sophia had agreed. It seemed harmless at the time. On the drive home, Eleanor had sung softly in the back seat, her voice a sweet lullaby that made Sophia smile. She hadn't noticed the loose strap on Elena's seatbelt. She hadn't noticed the truck barreling through the red light. The impact was instantaneous. Sophia remembered the sickening sound of metal crumpling, the airbag deploying too late, the scream that tore through her throat as the car spun out of control. And then, nothing. Just silence. The silence of the world collapsing. Her fingers gripped the doll tighter, the pain sharp in her chest. Andrew sat down beside her, his presence a muted comfort. He didn't try to hold her, didn't force her to speak. He simply sat, his own grief hidden behind the mask of someone who needed to stay strong. But Sophia knew. She knew how much he hurt, how much he blamed himself for not being there, how much he wanted to fix what was irreparable. In the days after the accident, Sophia had tried to go through the motions. She had tried to smile, to eat, to talk. But it was all a lie. Every moment without Elena was like a slow suffocation, and no amount of therapy or medication could change that. The guilt gnawed at her insides, and no matter what Andrew said, she knew the truth. If I had checked the seatbelt, if I had been more careful, Elena would still be here. The weight of it was unbearable. Sophia had begun to retreat, first in small ways, skipping meals, avoiding friends, and then in larger, more noticeable ways. She stopped answering the phone, stopped leaving the house. She stopped being Sophia. She had become a shell, an echo of who she used to be. Andrew had noticed, of course. He had tried everything: kind words, quiet support, giving her space. But nothing worked. He could see her slipping further and further away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That evening, as the darkness closed in, Andrew sat beside her, his hand hovering over hers but not quite touching. He stared at the old photograph on the wall, the one of the three of them at the beach, Eleanor perched on his shoulders, Sophia laughing beside them. It felt like another life, like it belonged to someone else. He glanced at Sophia, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on the wall. He wanted to say something, to tell her that they would get through this together, but the words felt hollow. The house was as still as ever. Andrew could feel the weight of the quiet pressing on him, heavier each day. He looked over at Sophia, unmoved from her spot on the couch, her eyes as distant as they had been for months. He sighed, turning his gaze to Francisca, the warm-hearted housekeeper who had been with them since the accident. "Could you keep an eye on her for a while?" Andrew asked softly. Francisca, with her steady presence and gentle nature, gave him a nod. "Of course, senor. Take your time." Andrew didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his coat, feeling the suffocation of the house follow him to the door. The cool air outside was a brief relief as he got into the car and pulled away, his mind already drifting elsewhere. He hadn't driven far when he saw her. At first, she was just a small figure huddled by a trash bin, half hidden by the shadows of the alley. Andrew frowned and slowed the car, squinting through the windshield. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, rummaging through garbage. Her clothes were torn, dirt smeared across her face, her hair wild and unkempt. She looked lost, fragile. But it wasn't just her appearance that sent a jolt through him. It was the man watching her from a few feet away. The man stood there, lingering too close for comfort. His posture was stiff, and his eyes locked onto the girl with an unsettling intensity. Andrew's heart thudded in his chest. Something wasn't right. He pulled the car to the curb and got out, crossing the street with long, deliberate strides. As he approached, the man's eyes flicked towards him, narrowing. Andrew ignored the tension crackling in the air and moved toward the girl. She didn't see him at first, too focused on what she was doing. "Hey!" Andrew called, his voice steady but firm. The girl froze, her head snapping up. Her eyes, wide with fear, darted between Andrew and the man standing a few steps away. The man shifted but didn't say anything, his gaze cold and predatory. Andrew stepped closer, positioning himself between the two. "It's okay," he said, his tone softer now. "Are you all right?" The girl didn't answer. She clutched a stale piece of bread in her small hands, her shoulders hunched, as if she expected him to take it away from her. "What's your name?" Andrew tried again, kneeling down to meet her eye level. The man behind him lingered, watching. Andrew could feel his presence but refused to turn around. "Hope," she whispered. "Do you have anyone with you, Hope?" Andrew asked, his eyes searching hers. She shook her head, a tiny, quick motion, and it broke something in him. She was alone, completely alone. The man shifted again, taking a step forward. Andrew finally glanced over his shoulder, his eyes sharp. "You should go," he said to the man, his voice low, laced with warning. For a moment the man hesitated. Then, with a sneer, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back to Hope. "You don't have to be scared," he said gently. "I can help you. Are you hungry?" Hope nodded, still clutching the piece of bread. Andrew stood and offered his hand. "Come with me. I'll get you something better to eat, okay?" She hesitated for a long moment, staring at his outstretched hand. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her hand was small, cold, fragile. Andrew felt a wave of protectiveness surge through him. This girl, she was like a mirror to the loss he had felt, the pain that lingered in his home. But there was something more, something he couldn't quite place. She needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed her too. "Let's get you home," he said softly, guiding her toward the car. As they drove, Andrew's mind raced. He had acted on impulse, he knew that, but the sight of Hope, so alone and vulnerable, had struck a chord deep inside him. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "Everything's going to be all right, Hope," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it more for her benefit or his own. The car rolled to a stop in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the thick evening fog. Andrew turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, staring at the familiar sight of his home. The stone facade, once warm and inviting, now loomed like a monument to grief. He glanced at Hope in the rearview mirror, her small frame barely visible in the shadows of the back seat. "This is it," he said softly. Hope didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the house, uncertainty etched across her face. Andrew opened the car door and stepped out, walking around to open the door for her. She hesitated before stepping onto the cold driveway, her worn shoes making faint scraping sounds against the gravel. He gestured toward the front door, and they walked in silence toward the house. Inside, the air was thick, the quiet almost suffocating. The warmth of the heater did little to dispel the coldness that had settled into the house long ago. Hope looked around, taking in the dimly lit hallway, the heavy furniture, and the faint smell of wood polish. Everything felt too still, too heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Francisca appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Hope, but quickly softened with understanding. "Andrew?" Francisca greeted him with a nod before turning to the girl. "Who is this?" "This is Hope," Andrew said, his voice calm but strained. "She's had a rough time. I found her on the street. I thought maybe she could stay here for a little while, just until we figure things out." Francisca gave a small, knowing nod. Her eyes lingered on Hope, her face kind, but sad. "Of course, she's welcome here." Hope felt a slight easing of the tightness in her chest at the sound of Francisca's voice. There was something in the way the older woman looked at her, a quiet kindness that she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just words, it was something deeper, something genuine. "Come in, child," Francisca said softly, beckoning Hope to follow her into the kitchen. "Let's get you warmed up." As they entered the kitchen, Hope noticed how different it felt compared to the rest of the house. The faint smell of simmering soup and the low hum of the refrigerator gave it a sense of life, though dim, like a single candle flickering in a dark room. She sat at the small wooden table, her fingers tracing the edge of a frayed placemat as Francisca moved about, preparing a bowl of soup. "Thank you," Hope whispered as the bowl was placed in front of her. Francisca smiled but said nothing, watching as the girl began to eat slowly. After a few moments of silence, Francisca spoke again, her voice low and measured. "This house wasn't always so quiet," she said, her gaze distant as though seeing another time. "There used to be laughter here, joy, before the accident." Hope looked up, the spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Their daughter," Francisca continued, "Elena. She was only a little older than you, bright girl, full of life. But she's gone now, and since then, things have been difficult." There was no need for more explanation. Hope could feel the weight of the words, the lingering grief that clung to the walls. It made sense now. The coldness, the silence, the sadness that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. She had felt it the moment she walked in, like stepping into a space, frozen in time, unable to move forward. Francisca didn't say anything more, allowing the quiet to settle over them again. When Hope had finished her meal, the housekeeper gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll show you to your room," she said softly. They walked upstairs, the house eerily quiet. As they passed down the long corridor, Hope caught a glimpse of Sophia. She sat in a chair near the window, staring out into the darkness, her posture stiff and unmoving. Her presence was barely more than a shadow, a figure disconnected from the life around her. Even from the brief glance, Hope felt the depth of the woman's sorrow, a grief so thick it seemed to form a barrier around her. But there was something more. In Sophia's silence, Hope recognized a pain that echoed her own, a quiet, gnawing ache that couldn't be spoken, only endured. And though they hadn't exchanged a word, Hope felt an unspoken connection with the woman. They were both trapped in a world of loss, each carrying their own invisible burden. "That's Sophia," Francisca whispered, noticing Hope's gaze. "She hasn't been the same since Elena passed." They moved past Sophia's room, down to a small, sparsely furnished bedroom at the end of the hall. Francisca flicked on the light, revealing a plain bed, a nightstand, and a small window overlooking the garden. "It's not much," Francisca said, "Oh, but it's warm. Get some rest, dear." The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Hope sat at the edge of the small guest bed. The warmth of the blanket still clung to her, but inside she felt a gnawing emptiness. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, almost like a second skin. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the woman downstairs, Sophia, and the sadness that seemed to wrap around her like a shroud. Hope understood that kind of sadness, though hers had come in a different form, the kind that creeps up slowly, like the cold that had taken her mother. Downstairs, Andrew sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee quietly. Hope found him there, lost in thought, his hands wrapped around the cup as if he could draw strength from its warmth. He looked up as she entered and gave her a small nod. "You sleep okay?" he asked, his voice low but kind. She shrugged, taking a seat across from him. "It's quiet here," she said after a moment, the words hanging between them like unfinished thoughts. Andrew watched her carefully, sensing there was more beneath the surface. He didn't press. Instead, he waited, knowing that whatever Hope had to say, it needed to come on her terms. Hope hesitated, then spoke. "My mum, she used to make me tea when it was quiet like this." She paused, her fingers picking at the edge of the table, searching for the right words. "My dad, he wasn't around much, always at the bar. When he came home it was worse. But my mom, she was different. She tried to protect me, keep me safe from him." Andrew leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding. "One night," Hope continued, her voice steady but distant, "she had to go out for work. It was snowing hard, one of those storms where you can't see anything. She didn't want to go, but we needed the money." Her throat tightened, but she pushed through. "She never came back." The words fell into the quiet space between them, and Andrew let them linger. He understood that weight. The finality of loss. the helplessness of being left behind. He had felt it too when Elena was taken from him. That night, "It was the last time I saw her," Hope said, staring down at her hands. "After that, everything fell apart. My dad couldn't handle it, not that he ever really could. I was on my own after that." Andrew didn't speak right away. He let her words settle in the air, feeling the unspoken connection between their losses. Grief was something they both carried, though theirs had come in different forms. He reached across the table and rested his hand on hers. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Hope didn't pull away, though she didn't respond either. Instead, she let the silence settle again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. There was a shared understanding now, a connection born out of their mutual pain. Later that day, as the house fell back into its usual quiet, Hope began wandering through its long hallways. She was curious, but also searching for something she couldn't quite name. The house felt lived in despite the silence. There were traces of a life that had once filled it. She wandered into a room at the far end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Inside, she found a small bed, toys neatly arranged on shelves and pictures on the walls. A girl's room, frozen in time. She stepped in slowly, her eyes tracing the space. A stuffed animal sat on the bed, untouched, a little dusty but still soft. She picked it up, holding it gently in her hands. On the dresser, there were pictures. A little girl with dark hair and a wide smile, the same girl she had seen in the photos, scattered around the house. This was Elena. The name Andrew had mentioned once, quietly, when he thought she wasn't listening. Hope stood there for a long time, looking at the photos of Elena and Sophia together, smiling, laughing, a family whole and happy before everything had fallen apart. She could see now why the house felt so heavy. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of that girl, of the joy she had once brought. She placed the stuffed animal back on the bed and quietly left the room, her steps softer now, as if she didn't want to disturb the ghosts of the past. As she made her way back downstairs, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't alone here. This house had its own grief, its own pain, and somehow being part of that made her feel less like a stranger and more like she belonged. The house remained quiet, but not as silent as before. A faint hum drifted through the rooms, soft and tentative, as if testing the boundaries of the silence that had once suffocated the place. It came from the living room, where Hope sat cross-legged on the floor, a few of Eleanor's old toys spread out in front of her. She wasn't playing with them in the way a child normally would. Instead, her fingers traced the worn edges of the toys, as if trying to understand the life they once held. Her voice, barely audible, hummed a tune. It was a simple melody, one she didn't know the origin of, something that had come to her while she sat in the stillness. The notes hung in the air, and though they were small, they felt like the first ripples breaking the surface of a frozen lake. Andrew stood in the doorway watching her. He hadn't intended to stop, but something about the sound of her humming had drawn him closer. For days now, Hope had been moving through the house, her presence quiet, yet persistent. He hadn't expected much from bringing her here, only that she might have a safe place for a while. But now, watching her as she gently touched Eleanor's toys and hummed that familiar tune, something stirred in him, a glimmer of hope. Across the room, Sophia sat in her usual spot, her body still and rigid as always. Her gaze was unfocused, drifting somewhere far beyond the room. Yet there was something different today, something Andrew hadn't seen in months. He couldn't place it at first, but then he noticed it, the slightest movement, almost imperceptible. Sophia's lips twitched. It was subtle, the faintest sign of life. Her mouth moved, as if trying to form the same tune that Hope was humming. The movement was so small that anyone else might have missed it. But Andrew saw it. He felt a tightening in his chest, the kind that comes when you're afraid to hope too much, but can't help yourself. Hope, unaware of the small miracle happening across the room, continued to hum, her voice growing a little stronger as she became more comfortable in the space. She picked up a stuffed bear, the same one she'd seen in Elena's room the other day. Its fur was matted and faded from use, but it felt warm in her hands, as if it still held pieces of Elena's childhood. The song she was humming shifted, almost unconsciously, into something else, a tune that came not from her own memory, but from the house itself. It was a song that Elena used to sing. He realized it now as the melody filled the room, how much he had missed that sound. Sophia's lips moved again. This time there was no doubt. She was trying to hum along. The notes came out disjointed, faint, but they were there. Andrew froze, hardly daring to breathe. He hadn't seen this part of her in so long, hadn't seen anything beyond the blankness she had retreated into after Eleanor's death. But now, sitting there, she was reacting. She was reaching out, however small the gesture. Hope's voice trailed off, and she looked up, sensing the change in the room. She saw Andrew watching Sophia, saw the hope in his eyes. Turning her head slightly, she noticed the way Sophia's lips trembled, caught between silence and song. She's humming," Hope whispered, as if saying it out loud might break the spell. Andrew nodded, his eyes fixed on Sophia. "Yeah, she is." The moment was fragile, like a thread connecting them all, and none of them dared to pull too hard for fear it might snap. But it was there, a sign, however small, that something in Sophia was still alive, that the silence wasn't as final as it had once seemed. Andrew moved closer, sitting down beside Sophia, careful not to disturb her. He didn't say anything, just sat there, listening as she continued to hum in broken fragments, her eyes still distant but her voice, faint as it was, finally reaching them. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the smallest of changes. Hope spent more time near Sophia, not forcing her presence, but simply existing beside her. It was a silent understanding between them. Hope played quietly on the floor with Elena's old toys, while Sophia sat in her armchair, her eyes still distant but no longer vacant. The house had shifted. There was something less oppressive in the air, though it remained heavy with a grief that hadn't yet lifted. Hope didn't try to speak to Sophia. She knew instinctively that words wouldn't break through whatever barrier Sophia had built around herself. But she stayed close, and that seemed to be enough, for now. Every so often, Sophia's eyes would flicker toward her. Subtle movements, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Andrew was always looking. He watched from the doorway, as he often did, seeing Sophia's attention shift toward Hope, even if it was just for a moment. It was enough to make him stay hopeful, to keep waiting. Hope, in her quiet way, brought small changes into the house. She wasn't Eleanor. Andrew knew that. But there was a softness to her presence, a patience that allowed the home to breathe again, slowly. It wasn't just that Hope was a child, it was her innocence, her ability to sit in the stillness without needing to fill it with noise or conversation. She seemed to understand that the house was healing in its own time, just as its inhabitants were. One afternoon, Hope sat on the rug in front of Sophia's chair, the stuffed bear cradled in her arms. She wasn't playing with it, just holding it, her gaze fixed on the worn fabric as if it held some secret she hadn't yet unlocked. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows through the windows. Sophia's eyes, dull and distant, shifted slightly toward Hope. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that Andrew noticed from where he stood in the hallway. He didn't say anything, didn't want to break the fragile moment, so he just watched. Hope, sensing something, looked up. She met Sophia's gaze, briefly, but enough to feel the connection there. She stood, slowly and carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal, and made her way to Sophia's side. Without a word, Hope leaned in and gently kissed Sophia on the cheek. It was a simple gesture, full of innocence, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid in the house. The kiss was soft, tentative, like the first light of dawn breaking through after a long, dark night. For a moment, Sophia didn't react. Her body remained rigid, her eyes still locked on some far-off place. But then, just as Andrew thought the moment had passed, something shifted in her expression. A single tear rolled down Sophia's cheek. Andrew, standing at the doorway, felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't seen her cry in so long, not since Elena. The tear was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but to him, it was monumental. It was proof that somewhere inside, Sophia was still there, still feeling. Hope didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply stood by Sophia's side for a moment longer, then returned to the floor, curling up with the stuffed bear in her arms. Sophia's tear fell onto her lap, and though she didn't wipe it away, her gaze softened. There was a flicker in her eyes, something Andrew hadn't seen in years, a glimpse of the woman he had loved, the mother who had once filled this house with warmth and laughter. Andrew leaned against the doorframe, his hands trembling slightly. The first real hope he had allowed himself to feel in years stirred deep within him. It was fragile, yes, but it was there. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence in the house no longer felt permanent. The fever came on suddenly. One moment, Hope was sitting quietly in the living room, her small frame wrapped in one of the house's old blankets. The next, she was shivering uncontrollably, her skin burning with heat. Her eyes fluttered closed as a wave of weakness overtook her. Andrew noticed first. He'd seen her curl up earlier, pale and unusually quiet, but now her breathing had changed, shallow and rapid. Alarmed, he knelt beside her, feeling the warmth radiating from her body. "Hope?" he called softly, shaking her shoulder. No response. The worry tightened in his chest. Francisca entered the room just as he looked up, and her face paled at the sight. "She needs to be in bed, Andrew," she said quickly, her voice steady but laced with concern. Together, they carried her to the guest room, laying her gently on the bed. Hope's breathing was labored, her skin clammy. Andrew could hear her mumbling incoherently, the fever gripping her tightly. Sophia stood in the doorway, unnoticed at first. She had been drawn to the commotion, her usual stillness broken by a new awareness. Something inside her stirred, something long dormant. Andrew turned and froze when he saw her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia's expression wasn't distant. It was filled with concern. Her eyes locked on Hope, and before anyone could speak, she moved forward swiftly and purposefully. Sophia's hand went to Hope's forehead, feeling the fever beneath her fingertips. Her movements were quick, almost instinctive. "She's burning up," Sophia said, her voice steady but urgent. It was the first time Andrew had heard her speak with such clarity in months. "We need to cool her down," Sophia continued as if the words came naturally. She turned to Francisca. "Get me a wet cloth." Francisca, momentarily stunned by the sight of Sophia so animated, nodded and rushed out of the room. Andrew just stood there, watching, not fully believing what was happening. Sophia, The woman who had been lost in her own grief for so long was moving with purpose, her hands carefully adjusting Hope's blanket, her gaze focused entirely on the girl. "Call the hospital, Andrew," Sophia said, looking directly at him. "She's not getting better." Andrew blinked, momentarily frozen by the directness of her voice. "Right, I'll call them now." As he fumbled for his phone, he realized what was happening. Sophia was here, truly here, emotionally present in a way she hadn't been since Elena's death. The urgency in her movements, the concern in her voice. It was all so familiar, the same maternal instinct he'd seen countless times before. Sophia's hands gently stroked Hope's hair as the young girl whimpered in her feverish state. "You'll be all right," she whispered softly. "We'll take care of you." When Andrew returned from the call, Sophia was still there, sitting beside Hope, her hand resting on the girl's arm. There was something in her face that he hadn't seen in years, a quiet strength, a determination. It was as if a small part of her had come back to life. And in that moment, Andrew knew. Sophia was returning. The cold, fluorescent lights of the hospital flickered overhead as they rushed through the doors, Hope limp in Sophia's arms. The world seemed to blur around Andrew as he kept glancing over at them, not quite believing what he was seeing. Sophia, so present, so engaged, cradled the girl with a tenderness he had feared was lost forever. "She's burning up," Sophia had told the nurse with a quiet urgency as they entered the emergency room. Now, seated in the waiting area, Sophia held Hope close, whispering soft words that Andrew couldn't quite make out. He stood nearby, still processing, his heart pounding from more than just the worry for Hope. Sophia hadn't let go since they arrived. Her hand never left Hope's forehead, her fingers brushing the girl's damp hair back with rhythmic tenderness. The sight of it tugged at Andrew in a way he hadn't expected. There she was, the woman he had once known, the mother who'd cared for Elena with the same unwavering love. "She's going to be okay," Sophia murmured, almost to herself. But the words felt as though they were meant for both of them. There was a softness in her voice, a steadiness that Andrew hadn't heard in years. He sat down next to them, still cautious, not wanting to disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. "She's tough," he said quietly, looking at Hope's pale face. "Just like Elena." Sophia's eyes flickered to him, a brief moment of connection that hadn't been there for so long. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The way she gently cradled Hope in her arms spoke volumes. The minutes stretched into hours, but Sophia never left Hope's side. Andrew watched in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him, but there was something else too, a quiet hope, creeping in where there had once been only resignation. A doctor appeared, breaking the stillness. "Her fever is coming down," he said, his voice calm. "She'll need to rest, but she's out of danger." Sophia exhaled a breath she had been holding for too long, her shoulders dropping slightly. Andrew saw the tension ease from her body, but she didn't release her hold on Hope. Not yet. "She can stay here overnight, just to be safe," the doctor continued. "You both should get some rest as well." Andrew looked at Sophia, expecting her to show some sign of exhaustion, but her focus remained entirely on Hope. "I'll stay," she said softly, and there was no room for argument. The hours slipped by. Sophia sat by the hospital bed, watching over Hope as she slept. Andrew, leaning against the doorframe, saw the transformation in his wife, a woman who had been shattered by grief now beginning to piece herself back together. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence that had suffocated them for so long. It was a peaceful stillness, like the calm after a storm. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him, waiting. He had been thinking about this moment for days, rehearsing the words, but now that it was here, they seemed to slip from his grasp. Sophia entered the room slowly, her steps deliberate, and sat across from him. There was something different in the way she moved now, a quiet strength that had begun to emerge since hope had come into their lives. Her face, once hollowed by grief, had softened. She was still healing, but there was light in her eyes again. Andrew cleared his throat, unsure how to start. "I've been thinking a lot about Hope," he began, his voice steady but low. "About everything she's brought to this house. To us." Sophia nodded, her gaze fixed on him, listening intently. It was still new, this feeling of having her back, really back, and Andrew couldn't help but pause for a moment to appreciate it. "We've been through so much, Sophia. More than I ever thought we could handle," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But I think we've been given another chance. With her." Sophia's eyes flickered, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. Andrew could see the weight of the decision settling on her. For the first time since they'd lost Elena, they were talking about the future, about building something new. "I want to adopt her," Andrew said, the words finally spilling out. "I want her to stay with us, to be part of our family." Sophia's breath caught, and for a moment he feared he had said too much, too soon. But then she blinked back tears and nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "She's brought life back into this house. Into me." Andrew reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It was warm, real. For so long he had only felt the cold distance between them, but now there was something solid, something hopeful. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Sophia continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But Hope, she's given us something I thought we'd lost forever." They sat there in silence for a moment, the decision hanging between them. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward a new beginning. "We'll adopt her," Andrew said softly. The process of adopting Hope had seemed like a formality at first. Andrew and Sophia were ready to make her part of their family in every sense, but the journey was interrupted by an unexpected complication: Hope's biological father. A man had suddenly appeared, demanding his rights, though it quickly became clear he wasn't interested in Hope's well-being. The courtroom was silent as the man made his demands, his voice grating as he suggested they could settle things privately. Andrew clenched his fists at his sides, anger bubbling under the surface. It wasn't about Hope for this man, it was about money. He made it clear that unless Andrew and Sophia paid him off, he would contest the adoption, dragging it out for as long as possible. Sophia sat beside Andrew, her face tight with tension, her eyes never leaving Hope, who was sitting in the front row, her small hands folded in her lap. She didn't understand all of it, but she could feel the tension, the uncertainty in the air. After what felt like an eternity of hearings and negotiations, the man's greed became obvious to the court. His claim on Hope wasn't one of love or care, but of desperation and extortion. The judge, a stern but fair woman, saw through him. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed, the weight of weeks of worry hanging over everyone. The judge's gavel cracked sharply as she called for order, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at the biological father. "You have no right to use this child as leverage," she said, her voice cold but full of conviction. "Your actions have proven you are not acting in her best interest. Hope's future lies with those who have shown her love, care, and stability." Andrew's heart pounded as the judge turned to him and Sophia, her expression softening. It is clear to this court that the only family Hope truly has is sitting before me." There was a pause, the air heavy with emotion. Then, with one final stroke of her gavel, the judge spoke the words they had been waiting for. "Hope is now, legally and irrevocably, the daughter of Andrew and Sophia." The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, and Andrew exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Hope, who had been sitting frozen in her seat, suddenly stood up, rushing into Sophia's arms. The three of them stood together, tears of relief and joy flowing freely. They were a family, officially. The house, once a place of unbearable silence, was now filled with the soft hum of voices. Family and close friends gathered in the living room, their faces warm with smiles as they congratulated Andrew and Sophia on the adoption. The air was different today, lighter, filled with the kind of quiet joy that came after a long, painful journey. Hope sat between Sophia and Andrew, a small smile tugging at her lips as she listened to the chatter around her. The celebration was modest, nothing grand, just a simple gathering. But to her, it felt monumental. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just passing through, she belonged. Sophia moved through the room, offering quiet thanks to the guests, her face calm, almost serene. It was the first time many had seen her truly present in years, and they couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. She smiled more easily now, her eyes no longer clouded by the constant weight of grief. Instead, there was a quiet strength about her, a woman who had faced the darkest of days and emerged, scarred but whole. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift home, Andrew and Sophia found a moment alone in the kitchen, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. They stood together, leaning against the counter, the noise of the party still faint in the background. "We made it," Andrew said, his voice low, a mixture of relief and wonder in his tone. Sophia nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I didn't think we would," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But Hope, she changed everything." Andrew smiled, a deep, quiet gratitude filling his chest. "She gave us something to hold on to again." Sophia's eyes softened as she looked around the room, taking in the warmth, the love that now filled the space. For so long, this house had been a place of loss, a monument to everything they had lost. But now it felt different. It felt like a home again. "I'm glad she found us," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So am I," Andrew replied, squeezing her hand gently. As they rejoined Hope, who was waiting by the door, they felt something new, a sense of wholeness, of a family rebuilt not from what was lost, but from what had been found. The future, for the first time in years, felt full of hope. And that, my friends, is the story of how broken souls found a way to heal through shared pain. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the people we least expect can come into our lives and bring light in the darkest moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone unexpected changed your life? And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories that inspire, move, and remind us all of the beauty in human connection. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and take care of one another. See you in the next video.